Hello, my friends. This is YouTube Masterclass. It's for the program's Coursera. That's where you watch classes and take classes and audit classes online. The cool thing about an audit is you just have to listen to the things in the class. You don't have to look at me saying it. You know, you can hear what I'm saying without seeing my picture when talking, but it makes more sense if you watch me because then you kind of catch when I'm joking or not. And I only throw a couple of jokes in a lecture. Now, I lecture for USC, Calarts, and UCLA, and not really so much UCLA because that was a class I used to teach, but Harvard is what you can get credit for in this class, and I lecture for them. Now, there's some other schools I can lecture at, and there's other programs through schools I can lecture at, but usually that's on an individual basis. That you'd have to sign up for the class on Coursera is pretty much the only way to take it, and that's because it's an online class and it gets remoted to Calarts, USC, and Harvard, and UCLA and my local school, CMU, say there's people at those schools that watch that. So I appreciate that you're watching it. If you're taking it as a class and your school approved of it, I think CMU and UCLA will do that. CMU is Colorado Mesa University, and that's downtown where I used to teach psychology for a while. Back in 2018, 2017-ish, I taught psychology at CMU. And then I came across a way to get the underwriting for the radio station because it's KMSA 91.3 and it's really rad metal and grunge and like it has all these Western songs even sometimes. I mean, it's been going on since back in the day with Matt McAllister. I know I've talked about this in the interim and we're teaching a class on the Western, but I know I've talked about this. But the point is like we acquired the station that we used to run as in high school, and now it's great because we can put across the message to the CMU guys, yeah, when I was teaching psychology, now I'm teaching Masterclass, and you'll have to see if you can get that on an individual student basis if you want to take a cinema course. And this is film study. Now, film study is an interesting topic because I've talked about this too, and it's like film study is like learning more about how film works, how the film process goes, what is film. You have all the questions like, film is done how and where did it originate? These are questions you want to know. Why does it exist isn't really a question we ask because you're like, well, it already does. So where are you going to come? Wouldn't you rather it exists than it doesn't? So then you go back to ontology and you're like, what's the origin? So film study puts this category of like philosophical questions that become necessary to extrapolate or exceed a certain volume of necessary answers to the questions that explain things that you know is there, but you haven't figured out the answer to. So you'd be like, well, what do you typically view editing to be in a movie? And you could say montage, but there's a difference between montage and editing. Montage is how there is editing in a movie, and editing is the process of putting the editing together. And that's scene after scene, or you plug it in. Montage is kind of has to be playing to be montage. Like the movie, that's why they have projectors in the first place, because it's playing the montage, and that's how you know it's a montage. Because if it was going and it was all the same image, you'd be not so much montage, but it'd be mise en scène. So, and mise en scène is not so much the production design, but seeing it in the film. This is the weird part, even as it moves, because you have to move props across the room. So it's like production design. You're like, well, okay, that's the things you move too, but that's only the object. Well, yeah, because the person is the actor. I mean, unless it's a robot, then it's kind of both an actor and a prop, but not really. It's a prop in scenes where they put things far away and put things close up, because then you're using a different model of the prop that you were going to use. Like if there's a droid running around the table, I'm not saying that like everybody uses the same effect, but mise en scène just means a long production design scene. And you kind of have to picture it off screen. Like we're thinking like Barry Lyndon, suddenly everybody's looking at each other and they're frozen in time. And Barry Lyndon's like smoking a cigarette and he doesn't even know what scene it is, Ryan O'Neal. And it's all like that cucumber yellow and red color that Kubrick always goes for ever since The Killing was in color originally. I don't know. But it's like, okay, I know that you can sometimes audit these courses, and I know sometimes we listen into things on the radio. The point of the radio thing is like, I gave them this list of songs at 91.3 that were like from different genres. And you can see the different genre. We wrote this book on classic rock and everything. And I'm not saying this that you have to keep track of this because we haven't exactly gotten to the westerns I was going to show you today. It's that I want you to know that you have to not really take this with a grain of salt, but the answered question after the beginning may take some time. So it's kind of like after you've seen one or two courses, you might start to understand it. But I'm not requiring anyone take this. I'm not requiring you at all. You can to get an elective or credit at USC, Calarts, or Harvard. And with that, we know there's answers to some of this. And in the genre of Western, you get the idea that there's mise-en-scène and montage directors. And you know Sam Peckinpah is good at montage, and since you're watching it on screen, as it's playing, it's kind of going on this timeline, even in the digital age, to show you each clip. Only the timeline in the old way was the film, which wound up in a big, like circle, and you put the film away. But with the video, it's like it records so much on a thin line, and the smaller you get, the more you can record. So that's why the tapes get smaller that record more sometimes, and that isn't always true. Because some tape goes off the European standard, and that's the other way. So it's like it gets bigger as it is bigger, And so we got the fact that montage is playing by Sam Peckinpah. He does Wild Bunch. Now, Sam Peckinpah came from television. He was doing different shows on TV, and he had worked on The Rifleman, and that was one that he always liked. He did Deadly Companions, and then later he'll do The Wild Bunch, and those were Westerns. And you're like, okay, there were other Westerns there too before The Wild Bunch, but this is the ultimate Western, The Wild Bunch, because it's about these guys that get together, and they're all crooks, and they're all outlaws, and they're all cowboys, and they're all lost, and they're all in the wrong town, and they're all drunk, and they all get together, and they're like, they've known each other from the military. And so they're all drunk, getting together, they get even drunker, they blow places up, they get blown up in the Civil War. I mean, here's this like good, the bad, and the ugly kind of thing going on in a few years that like has this whole Wild Bunch. Big obscene production design, but it's in the middle of these super zap quick montages, and like people are falling off of buildings, they get shot in a Western, everybody's got their cowboy hat, and then you see like it flips the camera back to the guy watching, shooting, and then back to the guy falling, and he hits the ground. And his is going slower in time by overcranking, so you're like, his is going slower than the guy standing there shooting, which is more like in real time. So, to see Sam Peckinpah's kind of thing, you got William Holden in the movie, Ernest Borgnine. There's a lot more. There's Ben Johnson, Warren Oates. I mean, those are good characters in a film. And Warren Oates, we know in Peckinpah's Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, which is his final film, and that's really his best film. I mean, it's a road movie, and it's not a Western. He only made like he made a lot of TV Western shows and TV special movies for Westerns. And then you get to like pretty much by Deadly Companions, he's a film guy. And then at the end of the career, he kind of does some of John Lennon's son's music videos for MTV. And that was the last thing he really did. But Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia was his last theatrical film. Not that he didn't make more that never came out. But he made the Alfredo Garcia. And that's where these guys have to go after this severed head of this big colony boss in Mexico who actually, or he kind of lives in Texas too. He has all this property, And it's shady to know whether it's Mexico or Texas that he owns property in, but it's somewhere in there above. He already has his head cut off. He's like this land baron, has his head cut off, and he's dead. And then he got his head, but the whole thing is that super road movie battle crazy Mad Max not really Mad Max, but shooting at each other on the road to get to the place where Alfredo Garcia's head is, and then they put it in their bag. They have to blow everybody away that they stole the head from. I mean, at the beginning of the movie, they behead him. And at the end, they're grabbing the head and running, dude. It's like Tarantino beats like some kind of Roger Corman thing. And I think Roger Corman did ante up to that box office in that one. I think he liked Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, but Peckinpah, he's got his own thing. Some people say that he has kind of this right-wing virtual reality thing where it's like the Wild Bunch, just because they're in the military, they're all of a sudden branded the right-wing. And I do think there is a certain truth to that, because it's the only one that's fair to like say that we do need soldiers. I know all over the world, everybody has problem with every other country's soldiers, because they're like, we don't want to be in the middle of an honest argument if we're going to say that, for instance, the Wild Bunch takes a necessary right or left wing view. And the point of that is if you were saying libertarianism, for instance, you could see where Straw Dogs has some implications of that, but you also see how the movie can be a social problems film in original intent and look to us more like that's what exploitation films are. But if you look deeper at exploitation films, they really are politically satirical in some way. So you have to take them as a kind of, and in this, it's totally about Vietnam, 1969 Wild Bunch, you know. And it's like the military is kind of right wing again because they serve the government. So you got this idea that like the government is really helping soldiers because they know they need them, even if the cause doesn't agree with everybody, and usually it never does anybody, but they have to do it anyway. So it's not like they're saying that like these soldiers are bad people, but they've all killed somebody. And so you're thinking, oh, that's terrible that someone's killed somebody. No wonder as kids we saw these guys as evil dudes. But then you're thinking everybody in the Western kills somebody eventually. That everybody kills somebody eventually in a Western is like, that's the whole point of the Western. Cowboy metaphysics says that in every Western we expect to see or deal with one or two deaths within the movie. In Wild Bunch, there's about 1,700 people that die, 17 main characters that die, and that's pretty much everybody in the movie is a main character, and about 2,300 people die by the end of the movie. And that's not for real. The real shooting was like 2 or 3 people died, and it was only 1 or 2 in the main cast, and it wasn't really any of these guys. And it's weird because like that's like years later too. It's not like it was right as it was happening. When they were filming it, it took about 10 years to make, so it was 5 years earlier that the 2 guys in the movie passed away. So that's really confusing about film history, because there was 2,317 people that look like they're dying that you just take as a character that dies. So if you take it as a character that dies, you're like, well, then that's only for the symptom of the Western. So when you're seeing a funeral in a Western, it seems real even in the old ones because they're by a gravestone, they're talking to the grave, and that's like always how they enchant the Western. Like in The Searchers, there's like this fake graves where you think everybody's already dead and they buried them and they actually carried her off. And it's like, well, they carried her off from the grave, and that grave looked real. It's like ghosts always are around graves in video games, you know. Legend of Zelda. You're like, well, these are Western films, and there's usually not a ghost in a Western film. But the thing about it is everybody remembers the guy that died for you. And in this one, the Wild Bunch would die for each other, even though they'd do anything wrong anytime. And they're like the Vietnam guys. They're looked at as bad guys, and they killed a lot of people, you know. But what these actors may or may not have killed anyone for real. Who knows? I don't know what goes behind closed doors of who kills who. I'm not going to ask, but in the movie, if they're a killer, we usually don't associate that to their career as though they killed someone, whether we should or not. Just gravitate towards the, well, I don't think that guy's really dead, because it goes back to that theory. Do people in the movies that get shot always die during a movie? I mean, is that Great Train Robbery truth? Because were any of the actors in Great Train Robbery that got shot in Great Train Robbery? And there's like 7 guys that get knocked off the train with bullets, and there's like these big puffs of smoke. And Great Train Robbery, being the first Western, isn't even like the point. And, you know, it's like that there's these billowing smokestacks and these big train going by, and there's these guys on the top, and they're shooting at them, and it's like they're knocking them off the train. So it's like, did those actors recover? Or were they stunt doubles in the stunt scene, which is true a lot of times even with silent Westerns. And the stunt doubles were jumping off the train, making it look like the bullets were knocking them off that some other dude shooting. So did the guys die when they fell off the train? And I'm telling you, more so than always in film history, unless it's like some weird kind of underground cult thing, is like the guy who dies in the movie that's a stunt double almost never dies. But they say stunt doubles usually die by their 100th stunt. So there's like this funny movie where this guy's made 101 stunts, and then his next one he's always going to die, and he makes like 8 more stunts and lives through the movie. And I don't remember who's in that, but it's like, that's a good one. And the stuntman in Once Upon a Time in America? Once Upon a Time in Hollywood? Sorry, the first one's Sergio Leone. So it's great that Tarantino, who directs kind of like that, Sergio Leone with Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, he'll open up these big mise-en-scène shots. Mise-en-scène is the playing of a long scene and defining the production design. Now, in these westerns, you have like Monument Valley and John Ford. These guys kind of use the Alcon Range for Italy, which is a weird place anyway. Cinecittà, where Fellini shot Satyricon. And they'll shoot these big venue scenes, and there's all these guys, they're like thinking that Leone gets into montages when he's in a close-up. See, Peckinpah montage or anything. He'll do the shot-to-shot frame different. The match on action, though, even though it's a cross-cut, it's parallel action, the match on action is still pretty much there, except it's weird because the slow-mo that goes down in the Wild Bunch when somebody gets shot off a hill, to the image of the guy watching it fall, to the image of the guy falling again, the guy in the middle looks like he's just watching, but his clip is on for about the same length. But that makes sense because there's two sides to the other clips, and this half is long, so it's like a whether it's a 3-second clip, they'd each be about a second apiece because they'd have to be because they're in the same frame. And I know that's getting a little confusing, but on these montages, if they're 3 frames a second, 3 seconds a frame, that makes them 72 frames per 3 seconds, and that's about what you get on average with normal production design, normal montage between shots, because that's what most the Hollywood standard is. Nobody really talks about that. But when you're shooting a big long movie and it's like hours long, and Wild Bunch is like 3 hours long, with all of it back in the movie that was censored, and if it's a 3-hour movie, The Wild Bunch, where it was eventually censored, then that means it's already came out in 1969. This is the director's cut. I'm not really sure what year the director's cut came out, but it might have come out in 1969. There was already a release of this by Sam Peckinpah that wasn't the one he wanted to release, but now the movies are getting like Midnight Cowboy winning the Oscar, and Easy Rider out that year, and everything about Vietnam protest and love and peace generation. Wild Bunch come along and say, yeah, we may be military, but we've kicked some asses, taken some names. Sometimes we don't always have the best luck. Sometimes we have good luck. Will we die for someone? Only if it's a noble cause. And these are like views that are handed out by the Westerns in general, and Western cowboy metaphysics says when you expect to see a funeral, it's going to propel the Western to the action that keeps propelling to find out why there's a gravestone or who that gravestone's for and how we represent that. Even the Searcher says you only see it once. It's probably not her grave because she's alive. You see the Native American come in, and you're like, well, and it really isn't. It's like Ricardo Montalban or something. They take like this. He's got this big headdress on. Like I said, Native Americans don't really wear headdresses. They might. I don't think they call them that, so they don't. I don't want to get into that, but too much, except that Native Americans are, not really a subject I can study at like great length because it makes me too sad. But that was something that was, ingrained in their culture, that sad things happen, and like nowadays it's like, well, you see a sad movie and it may make you cry, but you don't tell anybody. If you told someone you cried from, like, I've cried, like, tears of joy just watching Max von Sydow and The Seventh Seal, so I get really excited and lathery about music and movies. Because not because I'm into that field or whatever, just because, like, music and movies just stimulate my mind to feel, like, in good presence of something I enjoy. So that's like entertainment. You could call me weird, but I actually like movies and music even though I study them. I know what can go wrong a little bit. The Wild Bunch may not have much wrong, but the appearance of right-wingedness may throw people off in Sam Peckinpah. But even bringing the head of Alfredo Garcia doesn't seem like it isn't democratic because everybody's involved. And Alfredo Garcia is a powerful baron lord, It's not like, and it's like an exploitation film, but Hollywood style. It doesn't seem like that movie makes any calls that Alfredo Garcia wasn't super powerful and didn't own all that land. Because in an old Western, you get the idea that, like, if there was ever a Spanish or Mexican character, they could kind of be a leader in the military, but they didn't own much. Like, they were kind of abandoned in those posts. Like in Fort Apache, when Pedro Armendariz comes in on the horse, he's leading a troop of himself, and he's telling Custer to leave the war before he gets obliterated. And he's like, well, what is it? Geronimo is telling Pedro Armendariz, and the guy that plays Geronimo isn't Ricardo Montalban. He tells the guy to go tell him again to get out of there, or he's gonna get killed. And they go down there and they tell him to get out of there. So he charges down to see what he's gonna get killed by, and he gets killed. And they don't really show what happens when he gets killed, but history books say it wasn't even a big deal. He just got scared when he saw the enemy's leader, and he fell off his horse and landed on his head and died. That was Custer. But Little Big Man makes it out to be that there was someone there that was like democratically, and there's a Little Big Man's a great Western in the 70s too. It's like a few years after Wild Bunch. And he's like, well, Little Big Man, if you think he's tricking Custer to go get killed, it's kind of what they do in Fort Apache, but he gets confused in Fort Apache, and Custer gets tricked by Dustin Hoffman as though he had prior information that this would all lead to the Trail of Tears, which is what Cheyenne Autumn shows. So there's kind of this conspiracy of the Old West, because the Old West was not happening during the time of the Western movie. The Western movie, like the Civil War and D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, was 50, 60 years after that actually happened. So there's this big gap in time. Like, this kind of stuff wasn't just normal. I mean, you could go to a ranch and kind of have like a Western theme to it, or you could go to a theme park and kind of see some Western guys, or like an old-fashioned town that has a couple of cowboys or some bikers that were what cowboys used to be. Like even Easy Rider Wild Punch comparison in the same year. So now we're saying, okay, slow down the Western, so we understand that it looks like the Old West, but we've never actually seen the Old West, because the Old West is like these towns you can see in Monument Valley, but they still have cars and gas stations, and they might have one stagecoach, but it's probably just stopped there next to the gas station. No, I'm not bragging that I've been anywhere like that. I have been to some Monument Valley and everything, but I don't know what the life is down there. But I never see, like, if they're making a movie, you can tell that they're down there being cowboys or whatever. Or if you're at a country show, country rock or country music, there's a lot of cowboy hats in that, and there's a lot of people that are actual cowboys, even from Colorado and other places, that go to those, and that kind of preserves what happened in the Old West, because you think of all the popular singers that are making Western music. Like in Rio Bravo, we saw last week, where Ricky Nelson, makes this song in the movie, and Dean Martin and everything they're singing, and it's kind of it seems like it's a glitch in the movie, but it really isn't, because again, they're carrying the Hollywood classical image that's 3 seconds of mise en scène becomes montage on the next take, and then you calculate what you're viewing by each take. And then you can kind of re-separate this part and put the sections there after Peckinpah. That just means the shots are close together on the timeline. And long shots are going, the mise en scène, longer time than 3 seconds. We're thinking 3 times as long, because that's how big the screen, not this screen, but most theater screens are, 3-to-1. But they're not really, that's the biggest screen. So you compose the movie for the biggest screen, and later you hope you can adjust the size of the projection to see it on the screen you're showing it on. That there's 3x1 feet on a screen means it's usually 3-to-1, but that's only on the biggest Cinerama. You take it back to our big screens, and it's like 2.85-to-1. That's 2.85 units to 1 unit of width, like this, versus height, up and down. This one has 3 in reverse. So you can see where Hollywood classical cinema, even being a square, came up with about, less than a minute and a half of a scene at first when they're doing these long take film theaters. And unfortunately, most of the old silent film theaters, even with Buffalo Bill and the Indians, which was later a movie by Roger Altman, even though that was later lost, they say, all that footage. I've seen some of it, and it's weird, but a lot of it is lost because most of it disappeared because it was like that Tin Pan Alley, blow it up after it's made because it won't last. The film will deteriorate. It's made out of organic things. We don't know what this film is made out of. I can just hear Louis Fouillard in the silent era saying, I don't really know what this film is made out of. That's all he'd say, and then the whole cast would be scared the rest of the day. That's probably true, but the point is if there's like a silent film about it, it's not the same as the sound film. And the sound film, even though it's like Iron Horse in the silent era, the sound film is going to sound. For the jazz singer brings sound about, and then everybody puts it in their theater, everybody negotiates it into their film, but still evolving because of the difference of editing. That sound is edited to it in the same exact ratio of, like, if it's a square, you have about, six, what is it here? It's it's a 3, so one square would be 1 second, you would think, but it'd actually still be 3 seconds for one square. But if you're putting it in montage, you just bunch them together. But if you're doing a mise-en-scène report and having a long take last longer, then you have your 72 seconds to bring it out, you see. It's really confusing, and again, I run by it because we're sitting here going, so how does that help us view a Western and see it? Well, one thing we know is unless it's a movie or other things, it's not really the Old West as it was. But if you have a country music show, some of those guys know the Old West as it was. They're real old. But they don't know the 1850 version that's Civil War, that's later used in the 1895 version when the frontier closed, which is a train coming into a station. I mean, the frontier closes. We need trains to get to one side of the world, one side of the country to the other. And everybody in all these countries are developing trains. And you have the Iron Horse, which is weird because the covered wagon comes out before the Iron Horse, and there's no trains in it really. There's a few, but they show trains. Trains are here in real life still, and there are probably stagecoaches too somewhere, but they're going across this plain that's rarely stagecoached anymore because now there's highways and stuff to connect it. So how they even make these silent films is weird because there were already paved roads everywhere and big business buildings and sky rises in the 20s. Metropolis is 1928, and they pretty much built this real city to be Metropolis. It's still there, and I've never seen it. But Metropolis is still in Germany somewhere. And it's real scary to think there's a city that big and huge, and they really do run it still. And it's not really a theme park. Like in America, they'd make that into a theme park. Be like, oh, that's Metropolis? Well, it's Metropolis now. It's a theme park, But it's a real city. Does it confront problems like it did in the movie? That was probably dramatized. And again, we get back to that idea that if someone dies in a movie, like in The Wild Bunch, everybody ends up dying. They take out everybody with them when they go to save their friend Angelo, and they shoot everybody down in this big fort. Everybody's falling in that way where you see him falling for a second, and then it's like a second of it's a second of the hero shooting at him, and then, first you see him shooting at him, then you see him falling, then you see him shooting at him, then you see him falling, and he's lower each time, and that's on action, even with the other frame, is like impeccably dead on. So that's really hard to do. But aiming the production design to get it to last for just about best years of our lives, 72 seconds, which is like post-classical war movie, and these Westerns really get enriched by these heroes that come back from the war and still make Westerns. And before they did, it was like John Ford and Drums Along the Mohawk. And now it's like John Ford with like They Were Expendable, which seems like a cheesy movie, but all the military is going, we're happy we won, but we lost a lot of dudes back there, man. We're just like shocked that so many of our friends died. And that we still won that battle. I can't believe it. They're like this military, and Wild Bunch takes time to stop and laugh when they win a battle. That there's a whole right to guns thing that I don't think Sam Peckinpah's really saying take a gun out and always have a gun in Wild Bunch. That could get a little sticky between the right and left wing politics, because the right wing thing of it's like we're crooks, but capitalism needs its crooks. And we all agree with that. We're like, well, if capitalism didn't have gangsters, and the cowboys in a wild bunch were like the gangsters of the Old West, kind of. And you have to go through them because they're all like tied together by this like efficient group ethic. So there's a fishing group ethic, and you're like, well, in the High Plains Drifter, on the other hand, it's before we get to the fact that we're still dealing with the mise-en-scène of a movie like How the West Was Won, and then that was in the 50s. So in the 50s, they're doing these long shots. They have to hold the camera longer. The production design has to be set up exactly. And these are like, there's a lot of exteriors in Westerns, and it's still, the exterior has to be set up like the shot you would do in the world of the Old West that gets defined as the evolution of film continues to go. At first it's like Iron Horse. In 1925, we have Great Train Robbery, A Slave in His Trust, which I won't go into because that's D.W. Griffith, but Great Train Robbery, where it looks real. And we've never seen the Old West. So that's because there's still a culture. And again, it's because country music has allowed that culture. Even at that time, country music had started out. And so people are they're dancing at a dance hall. They're swing dancing, country swing dancing, like they're waltzing in Gone with the Wind, which was weird because it was country swinging under a big Confederate flag. And we're supposed to be offended by that. Because Clark Gable, he's offended by the South in Gone with the Wind. And Gone with the Wind meditates a period of time after the Civil War, which wouldn't be true because it's about the Civil War and then after, and then they started it again and then went after it again. And it was all after some Civil War had already happened. So you get this view that back in 1939, there was a textbook that said there were 3 civil wars. And they happened real close together. And kind of one led to another, led to another. And so it's not that it was re-edited to say the Civil War stopped here and started here and stopped here and started here. But like if you watch the movie carefully, even with the editing done exactly like they wanted, with kind of the screen like this and not really montage, you get mise-en-scène, really particular, expensive, that just means big items indoors, and you have to still expensively pay for the camera to get the outdoor shot of the mountain and the mountain range that even comes up in the Wild Bunch. So you're looking at these energies that are like coming from these movie genres that's like an action-packed view of what we thought from Great Train Robbery back to the novels of like, these Louis L'Amour, that even was later than Great Train Robbery. And you even go back further and you look at kind of these Buffalo Bill shows, but that's iffy. But if you go to these ranchoning country music ones that are later going to adapt into this sort of city slickers attitude, or these guys that own ranches, I'm sure somewhere in America someone's heard of something like a real cowboy still existing, because it was passed down from the person that was in the Old West that showed them what it was like to be. And there probably are people like that, but they don't admit it usually if they're in a situation where they're going to be seen by people, because they're probably old heroes, but they probably have a few things they don't want to talk about for reasons that no one can know. And usually it's a military reason. So these movies are kind of realistic. And if you date it back to the time of country music, those are the type of ranch hands you're going to get. I mean, to be a cowboy even now. And I know there's cowboy music that says there's still cowboys out there, but I mean, like in the sense of the gang, which is a gang like Scarface gang, only that are cowboys, back in the day of the 1850s, before or after all the civil wars were erupting. And see, G.W. Griffith's traditional because he says that the Civil War all happened during like this 5-year period, and there was no moment of slowdown during the Civil War. The aftermath, there was a little bit of slowdown with these slimy politics, they're trying to say. But I was like, okay, that's what slowed down the war, was slimy politics? Don't show that. That's like Dostoevsky saying the elimination of religion was just as bad as having it. Now we're all pessimistic about the whole thing, but we're still getting really extra energized by the fact that we just watched Wild Bunch, and as they're blowing up people in the Civil War, we keep forgetting, because suspension of disbelief does that these are these great actors we've seen in movies before. They weren't always in westerns. Now they're in a western. Now they have a western accent. They're up on their horse. They're doing like kind of, you see him on this cover, and even High Plains Drifter with its early Sergio Leone. It's like Sergio Leone already made The Good, Bad, and the Ugly and A Few Dollars More around the time of High Plains Drifter, which all came out at different times. This wasn't Sergio Leone, but the fact that it's Clint Eastwood's first film that he directed is significant because he didn't direct The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly and A Few Dollars More and all that. He directed High Plains Drifter, but it was during the same time he was in those movies, which he was kind of an assistant director on, training for High Plains Drifter. And that's Clint Eastwood's like origin on on film camera, but for TV, which had cameras that were sometimes even more expensive, whether they were studio or outdoor for TV, and we find out TV becomes the medium that's so expensive and so outrageously unexplainable how expensive it is, but makes it all back. It's hard to explain how that works because not everybody gets the wage that like comes back as when where they're saying, yeah, that's what the movie made. So a lot of the directors can get confused and never really know or not even care about what that ends up being because the production team has already assisted him in assembling a really expensive film like Gone with the Wind, but they've got to leave him to the technical details of figuring out how long the footage needs to be. And again, Birth of a Nation gives you the same classical time as the films, even like Judith of Bethulia and D.W. Griffith. That he doesn't really do a Western is because his are all during the Civil War. That the Wild Bunch is during the Civil War, it's suggesting that there's parts of the Civil War we don't want to know about. Because it's like, why were they fighting the Civil War after it was over, and was it the Mexican-American War that happened right after the Civil War? That was like a Civil War of its own. And it's weird because in Wild Bunch, in the Mexican-American War, it's still like calling it the Civil War. And the 60s were kind of commenting, well, that's the Mexican-American War, it's the Civil War, but we're commenting on Vietnam, social stature, and that's why we're getting kind of this montage, because montage used to be used for propaganda, used to be used for commercials. Propaganda is like, you see it and it has to be true in your mind. And that's like by tricking someone by saying this person's here, this jail cell's here. What do you say? Probably the person belongs in jail. And then you add a shot like that with mise en scène. It's like you're already showing the picture you want them to believe, so it's commercialized. And you say that's commercial because it cost us like $1 million to put that lamp right there. Even in a silent film, they say that. But that means it's worth $1 million. So suddenly, we'll probably get enough people to see it to make our $1 million back because nobody really ever sees a $1 million lamp. And these are just secrets on when you're making a film and where the cost comes from and where it comes from. That's not to say that you can't have a low-budget film be long and drawn out, as Godard has shown, although his films are not that low budget. They didn't really think in France on Contempt, for instance, they just were figuring this out, that the scene they shot was worth how much it cost. So now Weekend becomes one of the biggest budgets of all time. Even though everybody's doing Godard favors all over France, be like, Godard's making a weird movie, let's go crash our cars into each other and get in the movie. I'm serious, that's how they used to make movies in French. They probably still do. And sometimes those weird things happen in Hollywood where like, we're going to flood the city for a music video, in a rock video, And they're like, people have to know, and it's like, well, it won't really hurt anyone because we're diverting the water here. And you're like, okay, well, so they're flooding the city here. They don't really stage earthquakes for movies, though. Those are sound stages. And then it becomes that thing where it's like, okay, and then you have John Ford in not How Green Was My Valley, but She Wore Yellow Ribbon. And there's that tornado in the background of the shot. And it's a real tornado, but really it's the only shot of a real tornado that's in a movie except the documentary. Like those tornado chaser ones. Like Twister has some real tornadoes in it, but they're other footage of tornado chasers. The one in John Ford movie is back there because it just broke out randomly and they didn't know it was going to happen. Like no weatherman. The weatherman kind of knew that they were going to get winds, but then as soon as the weatherman knew that, following him around on the set, knew that the tornado was coming by, John Ford backed up the whole set. I mean, brought him way away from where the Monument Valley was, and they had to walk in this long file line, and the tornado's blowing in the background, and it's a totally epic shot. When these tornado chasers go after it, though, it's weird because it's not a Western, and that there were tornadoes in the Old West was not a question that they could figure out, and they were wondering if they should put the shot in, because it looks like there were only a few stuntmen there, and really had that tornado switch directions, which they said it could have, means it was a deadly dangerous shot that he never should have shot. Which is like that one in Strangers on a Train where that guy almost gets hit by the carousel and it's going super fast. Those are shots that we love in movies, and we're glad they survived. Whether the guy is a stuntman that almost, but you can see some of those movies where the stuntman almost dies and doesn't. And that was weird because what was it in Jackie Chan? He's doing Rumble in the Bronx. He jumps from building to building, breaks his leg, and now we have one of those things that's only on an outtake, but in the rest of the movie he's like limping on a broken leg, and you're not supposed to do stunts if you broke your leg. And usually that means there's a stuntman. That Jackie Chan does all his own stunts, like Tom Cruise and some other Hollywood actors, and that's what's great about Hollywood is you kind of have to train as a stuntman a little bit, even as an actor. You have to train as every position in a movie to even work in a movie. You have to be in every position to be in any position. And then you find out where you want to be later, or what you're gravitating towards, or what they hired you as originally. You still have to do all these other tasks. And there's like carrying tasks and there's shouldering tasks. And you look at a movie like Wild Bunch, all the giant guns and all the giant castles and all, in Mexico, and all the big Mexico things are big, the sets, and there's where the weird like roof shot where they're shooting people down there and sniping them, and those guys, that Prohibition League's there, and they're all getting shot on accident. Which is honestly like one of those, we're gangsters, we're cowboys. Wild Bunch shows gangster cowboys. The movie, The Cowboys with John Wayne, you have all these kids that want to be in the gang, the Cowboys, and they're like in their own little gang when they're young, but they don't call them gangs then. And the bunch seems like a weird number, but it's like they're talking about something that I don't want to get into, but it deals with bunches of fruit. Because there's this one scene where they've got this big stick and they fucking put this grape on it, and he's walking, and this scene, I don't know if it's still in the movie. Like I've seen these movies in multiple versions of Wild Bunch, this being the director's cut. I'm sure it's in there, but they're in Mexico. This guy wants one of the Wild Bunch that's Mexican to marry his daughter, and they're in this village that he tricked them into going to, and then they're going to sell them guns that they steal from the military that was owed to them, that they won't give to them because they already killed in the military in the Mexican-American War. And you're going, oh, wait, dude, if it's the Mexican-American War, why do they call it the Civil War? And I was like, well, because history books, not at the time the movie was made, but at the time that was happening, they thought it was still the Civil War because they just wrote in from it. And these cowboy dudes that were already pioneers, that were coming from the eastern of the country, that were like rich and exciting and living all these big ecstatic lives, had friends that lived in the Old West, and they're like, we're survivalists out here. We're gangster survivalists. And that was the original cowboy thing, where you had to meet them for justice, you had to meet them for security, you had to do for them what they need always. And if you can't do it all for them what they need, you have to prove to yourself that you can walk into this realm and be like appreciative. And everybody should be, because there's vast wealth in cowboyism, and that's one of the reasons a stagecoach is so expensive to make, and Hollywood likes to show expensive things to attract us to pay a lot to see the expensive things. And when you break it down into how much we pay to see a movie, people are going to say, oh, it's too much. But these movies cost so much to make because the horses have to be trained. And there's wranglers for that. And that came from the Humane Society with The Adventures of Dolly, the dog movie with D.W. Griffith. That there's a lot of horses in the Wild Bunch, And if there's grapes hanging over, it means that it's the wild horses that liked the bunch of grapes. I know that's really complicated, and we don't want to get into that too much because grapes kind of have this symbolism in Mexico, freedom, and grapes in America don't really have symbolism. None of our food has symbolism except maybe turkey for Thanksgiving. And that's meat, so other countries would be like, well, we don't understand why they would do that, but we have certain meats for our certain parties too, you know. Like we like certain ham on like Easter or whatever. I don't know. You know, it's like just these mental thoughts are all things from our culture that we think about. Now, why, this is the thing I'll say. Why I leave you with country music? Because you get someone like Johnny Cash who built like country music around Elvis for him to like just carry the torch and become rock and roll. But you got Johnny Cash here saying, I'm going to play with my guitar and I'm going to do it like I'm a cowboy. Well, cowboys, real cowboys, were already proceeding from these Western ideals that were helping and overshadowing and being the wranglers on these actual Westerns. But you never saw them because they were real old, and you have to be real old in cowboy view to be able to teach a younger person how to be like a cowboy. So these Western movies like John Wayne, that's why he was like a cowboy, because real cowboys, from even like before the Iron Horse and back to the day of their dad teaching them, like Jedis or something, you know, like samurais even, they become passed down through this lineage, through this caste system of all the pioneers that survived during the move west when the Civil War had ended. So, that's confusing. And then you get High Plains Drifter, and you're like, it's this existential thing where now all that's left from the good, the bad, and the ugly, which is kind of in Wild Bunch time, that the Civil War keeps breaking out again in different places, and maybe that's what they call battles. But it seems like there's these drawn out times when it's gone. The war is gone in High Plains Drifter. I mean, in the Searchers, we'll talk a little more about that some other time, but in High Plains Drifter, you're going, well, he's in this isolated town. There's buildings everywhere, like for a few dollars more, or a fistful of dollars. And it's like, those three movies were connected. This one kind of seems like it, but it seems like the town is dead in High Plains Drifter. And there's some things that happen in it that I'm not exactly going to reveal, but the Clint Eastwood Western is more of an descendant or antecedent of the Wild Bunch. The Searchers being before that, being the first one to have John Wayne acting like he's got problems that he can't explain, and most cowboys do, even his Stagecoach one is like how cowboys would act. How we know that is you go to a country music show, going back to Johnny Cash, they're showing these struggles of these Western guys who must have at one time been influenced by someone from the Old West, because they were all moving west in stagecoaches for real. We know that from history, because these guys out here that preserved the history, which most families try to do, preserve their history, know that the cowboys pretty much controlled the Western pioneer section, which is the frontier anyway. Just kind of this big section between the East and the West of the U.S., so you can still find that attitude today at country music shows. And most of that's because Johnny Cash like modernized the cowboy into this kind of thing. So I was saying again, like they did Content, and they had all this color, and it was light and beautiful, and you're like, John Godard kind of made it Hollywood style. He stretched out the mise-en-scène, the longer takes of production design. And it was kind of his costliest film, but he realized that secret that no one tells you is if you film something really costly, it's going to be costly to film it for one thing, and it's going to be costly to put it in the frame if you need to, especially when you're indoors, to rebuild the set. You'd have to rebuild the set, even for an outdoor view, that you could do that with blue screens, but this whole set is like that, all moving. And then it runs into a couple of people, gets into a couple of shoots out, but it's one of those Clint Eastwood films, and it's one of my favorite ones because he directs the film kind of like Sergio Leone, like Unforgiven, later in the 90s. And this is the contemporary, almost postmodern Western. So he's taking it seriously, but what I like about it is it's one of those, this is how you make a Western movies. It's showing you in the movie how to make the movie, and it's his first one that he directed. But you got to wonder how many assistant director jobs he had with Sergio Leone. And then you know Peckinpah, he took over the whole thing to confuse politics. And that's why in the sense you get this idea that Peckinpah is right-wing, because he seems like an anarchist. Because he's like, they all go back in for Angelo to this Mexican village. They have to kill everybody there, and you think that's unfair, except Angelo just got dragged through the ground and killed. And this is all in a movie, and you're going, even in How the West Was Won, the couple of graves we saw, they were these big drawn-out grave sequences. Those guys have all died in the movie. They're probably alive right now, and that's the reason actors in Westerns lived so long. Because a lot of times they'd look like they were dying, and they'd show that, and it'd be a heart stunt. So they'd be stuntmen, like John Wayne started out as, and John Ford started out as, and B.W. Griffith started out as stuntmen, because you have to start out as that if you're going to be an actor. And you have to get real strong, real buff, real strong, real buff to be a stuntman. Even Jackie Chan, dude, he's got those big, loaded Bruce Lee arms. So these guys in these westerns are real big dudes. They have to train. And these cowboys, of course, that own Baron of Arizona, these guys, they were big guys. And they had big muscles because they had to move a lot of stagecoaches hard. So you're like, okay, this is starting to make sense. I see what you're saying about Rio Bravo being a country western movie. But what are you saying about the deaths in the western? They're usually 99% of the time, even in El Topo, not the guy who dies in the film is really dying proof. Because these Western guys are the stuntmen getting shot and falling off their horses. So they're not really getting shot and falling off their horses. It's a fake bullet. They have fake blood and they're falling off their horse. And that starts way back with straight shooting, although the fake blood was different in the silent era, and not just because they had black and white back then, but even Hitchcock was saying, I got the ultimate real-looking blood in Psycho, and it's black and white, but we already see that in some westerns in black and white, and that scares us there. It only works for horror films where the buckets of blood are outdone and illustrated, but Wild Bunch has this whole blood mechanistic thing to it that Eastwood kind of tends to calm down in most of the films except Unforgiven. And it's like you have this fake blood, but it doesn't look like shining, it's coming down the hall. But Wild Bunch does have these things called blood ballets. And blood ballets are where everybody's shooting each other, and they're falling off horses, and the blood is going everywhere. And then you cut to a scene of something lyrical and nonstop, like these exploding buildings from way up high in an aerial shot in the Mexican-American War / Civil War that none of the history books kind of agree on. So I'll leave you with this today. We had a good lecture today. It was good, and I apologize for El Topo seeming too random and thrown in. The Searchers, which we'll talk about again, is the ultimate mythology of all Westerns from there on. That Stagecoach was taking covered wagon mythology, means covered wagon is kind of how it goes till about the Searchers. That there's a covered wagon in the Searchers is interesting because there's only one or two, and there's only one or two most of the time in these movies, not because I couldn't afford more, because in covered wagon, they're all coming across at the same time, which was more accurate. But these guys are filming it not because it's too expensive and it wouldn't make its money back. It's because there was a time when they all came across at once, and then the Old West was kind of ruled by the cowboys that were just riding one at a time, like in that movie Hateful Eight, where they're riding in that stagecoach. And that's accurate. There wouldn't have been a bunch at once, except during the actual excavation to the Old West. And that came in waves, and that seemed like the Civil War was going on in states beyond the East. And this gets really complicated, but the ultimate mythology of Stagecoach and Searchers, also you have to look at Red River and Rio Bravo. And as we move on, we'll draw ourselves back to those films, which may have to do with things we do later in the class, but I hope you got a little bit of information about this, and it's all right to say good things about Westerns, I do. It's like having wild horses and a bunch of grapes for them to eat, We'll talk later. Thank you. Bye.